The elderly Japanese woman stood on the porch of a Texas ranch house in the spring of 1966, holding a photograph of four American soldiers. She had traveled 6,000 miles and waited 22 years for this moment. Her hands trembled slightly as she raised one finger to knock on the weathered wooden door. Through the screen, she could hear the sounds of an American home, a radio playing Willie Nelson, the clatter of dishes in a kitchen, a woman's voice calling to children in another room. The smell of mesquite smoke drifted from a barbecue pit behind the house, mixing with the scent of bluebonnets blooming across the hill country. When James Carter opened the door, she looked into his face and saw the same blue eyes she remembered from a frozen island in Alaska. Eyes that had looked at her with something impossible that day. Not hatred, not contempt, but mercy. She said just 5 words, her English careful and precise. "You carried me through hell." James Carter stood frozen in the doorway. He was 45 now, his dark hair streaked with gray, a slight limp from an old war wound, making him favor his right leg. But his face transformed as recognition dawned. The years fell away. For a moment he was 24 again, standing in a blizzard, making a choice that would define the rest of his life. "Akiko," he whispered, "you're alive. You made it." Behind him the sounds of his Texas home continued. His wife Marie appeared at his shoulder, curious about the visitor. 2 teenage children peered from the hallway, sensing something important was happening. The afternoon sun beat down on the ranch. Cicadas sang in the mesquite trees. The smell of livestock and fresh-cut hay hung thick in the air. It was so completely, utterly American, so far removed from that frozen hell where their lives had intersected. Akiko Tanaka nodded slowly, tears already forming in her dark eyes. "I promised myself," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "If I survive, I will find the man who will refuse to leave me behind, to say thank you, to show you that your mercy mattered." James's own eyes welled. He had thought about those 15 women for 22 years, wondered if they survived the war, wondered if his choice that day, the choice that nearly killed him and his men, had meant anything in the end. Now here was his answer, standing on his porch in the Texas heat, holding a photograph from another lifetime. "Come in," he managed to say. "Please come in." But to understand why this reunion happened on a Texas cattle ranch instead of a frozen island, why a Japanese nurse would travel halfway around the world to find an American soldier, why she waited 22 years to say thank you, we must go back to the coldest day in American military history. We must go back to February 18th, 1944, to Attu Island, Alaska, to the most remote battlefield of World War II. To a moment when mercy and mathematics collided and 4 men chose the hardest path imaginable. We must go back to the bunker. But first we must go even further back, to a hot summer day in 1928, to a cattle ranch outside Austin, Texas, to a lesson taught by a grandfather to his 8-year-old grandson, a lesson about a wounded coyote and what it means to be a man. July 1928. The Carter Ranch, 500 acres of Texas scrubland dotted with mesquite and live oak. Longhorn cattle grazed in pastures that stretched to the horizon. Quarter horses dozed in the shade of the barn. The sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil, turning the earth hard and the sky white with heat. Young James Carter was visiting from Houston, where his father Martin had moved for factory work after losing the ranch in the Depression. But every summer James came back to stay with his grandfather Samuel to learn what it meant to be a Texan, what it meant to be a man. That particular morning, they found a coyote in one of the traps. Its leg was broken, twisted at an unnatural angle. The animal snarled and snapped, eyes wild with pain and fear. It was a varmint, a chicken killer, the kind of animal every rancher shot on sight. 8-year-old James stood back watching his grandfather approach the trap. He expected the old man to pull his pistol, expected the sharp crack of a gunshot, expected the problem to be solved the way ranch problems were always solved. Quick, final, practical. Instead, Grandpa Samuel knelt in the dirt beside the trap. His weathered hands, scarred from decades of hard work, moved gently. He spoke in a low, soothing voice to the terrified animal. Grandpa James said, "It's just a coyote. It kills our chickens." Samuel Carter looked up at his grandson. His eyes were the same blue that James would inherit, the same blue that would one day look at 15 dying women in a frozen bunker and make an impossible choice. "That's true," Samuel said quietly. "It is a varmint, and it does kill chickens. But right now, right this moment, it's also a living thing in terrible pain. He produced a roll of cloth from his saddlebag and began fashioning a splint. The coyote whined and struggled, but something in Samuel's touch seemed to calm it. "Now you listen, good boy," Samuel said as he worked. "There's folks in this world who'll tell you some lives don't matter, that you only help your own kind, that mercy is for the weak, that you save your compassion for people who deserve it." He finished the splint and sat back on his heels. The coyote lay still now, panting, eyes locked on the old rancher's face. "But here's what I know," Samuel continued. "A man's character isn't measured by who he helps when it's easy, when it costs him nothing, when everybody's watching and clapping him on the back. A man's true character comes out when helping costs him something, when it's hard, when it goes against what everybody else is doing." He stood up, dusted off his knees, and released the coyote's remaining legs from the trap. The animal limped away on 3 legs, the fourth held carefully off the ground, and disappeared into the brush. "You just let it go?" James asked, amazed. "But it'll come back. It'll kill more chickens." "Maybe," Samuel said. "Maybe not. But that's not why I helped it, James. I didn't help it because I thought it would change its nature or become a different animal. I helped it because of who I am, because of who I choose to be." He put one large, rough hand on James's shoulder. "You help the ones who can't help themselves, boy, even if they're your enemy. Especially if they're your enemy, because that's what separates men from beasts. The beasts just react, just do what instinct tells them. But men, real men, they choose. They choose compassion over convenience. They choose mercy over revenge. They choose life over death." Samuel Carter squeezed his grandson's shoulder. "That's the cowboy code, James. That's the Texas way. And don't you ever forget it, because someday you're going to be in a situation where helping someone costs you everything, where the smart move, the safe move, the easy move is to walk away. And in that moment, you're going to have to decide what kind of man you are." Young James nodded, not fully understanding, not realizing that 16 years later, standing in a frozen bunker on the edge of the world, his grandfather's words would echo in his mind and change the course of 19 lives. February 18th, 1944, Attu Island, Alaska, 6:30 in the morning, the 274th day in the tomb. Akiko Tanaka woke to absolute darkness and cold so complete it felt like drowning. Her first conscious thought, as it had been every morning for 9 months, was a question. Am I still alive? The second thought followed immediately. Are my women still alive? She forced herself to sit up, every muscle screaming in protest. The bunker was a cave carved into frozen earth, barely large enough for 15 women to lie down. The ceiling was so low she could not stand fully upright. The walls wept with condensation that froze into sheets of ice. The air tasted of smoke and sickness and despair. Akiko began her morning ritual, the routine that had kept them alive this long. She crawled through the darkness, checking each woman in turn, feeling for breath, for warmth, for a pulse in the hollow of a throat. Count them, always count them, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 15. Some mornings she half expected to find one cold and still. Some mornings she was almost relieved when she didn't. 15. Still 15. Another day they had survived. The daily rations came next. Akiko had a system refined over 274 days of starvation. 1 cup of melted snow divided among 3 women. They passed it around, each taking only the smallest sip, making the cold water last. The rice was worse. They had 347 grains left. Akiko counted them every single day the way a miser counts gold. 15 women, 347 grains. 23 days if they rationed perfectly. 23 days until they faced a choice that had no good answer. She divided the morning portion with mathematical precision. 7 grains for each woman. She placed them on tongues like communion wafers. The women knew not to chew, not to bite. You let a grain of rice sit on your tongue and slowly dissolve. You made it last. You tasted it for as long as possible because it might be your last taste of anything in this world. Akiko placed 7 grains on her own tongue and closed her eyes. For just a moment, she allowed herself to remember. Tokyo, 1940, her mother's kitchen, the smell of miso soup and grilled mackerel, pickled vegetables and fresh rice steaming in a wooden bowl, her father reading the morning newspaper, sunlight streaming through the shoji screens, her younger sister laughing about something trivial, imperfect. The memory was so vivid, so painfully real, that she could almost feel the warmth of that kitchen on her frozen skin. Then the memory shattered. Someone coughed a deep rattling sound that spoke of damaged lungs and infections beyond their ability to treat. The smoke did that. For 9 months they had burned whatever they could find for warmth. Bits of furniture, scraps of paper, pieces of wooden crates. The smoke had nowhere to go, so it filled the bunker, stinging their eyes, coating their throats, settling into their lungs like poison. Akiko opened her eyes to darkness again. The rice grain had dissolved on her tongue, leaving only the memory of taste. 7 grains today, tomorrow 7 more, until there were no more. And then the choice would have to be made. She had been a nurse for 12 years before the war, trained in Tokyo at one of the finest hospitals in Japan. She had delivered babies and set broken bones and held the hands of dying patients. She had thought she understood suffering, thought she had seen the full range of what the human body could endure. Atu had taught her she understood nothing. She volunteered in 1942, answering the emperor's call, young, idealistic, believing she was part of something glorious. They told her she would serve in field hospitals, tending to wounded soldiers in clean, organized facilities. They told her she would be a symbol of Japanese dedication and honor. They sent her to Atu instead, the most remote island in the Aleutian chain, where the wind never stopped and the temperature never rose above freezing, where fog was so thick you could drown in it, where men went mad from isolation and killed themselves rather than face another day in the gray void. The battle came in May of 1943, American forces landing to retake the island. Japanese command ordered a final banzai charge, a glorious death rather than surrender. The nurses were told to stay in the bunkers, tend to the dying, and when the Americans came, take their own lives. It was the expected thing, the honorable thing. Capture meant shame worse than death. But the battle ended in case. Communication lines cut, officers killed. In the confusion, 15 women found themselves trapped in a bunker that had been overlooked during the American sweep of the island. For months, they survived on scraps, on hope, on the belief that rescue would come. Rescue never came. Their own military had forgotten them or assumed they were already dead. The bunker became their tomb. Or so they thought. Akiko moved through the darkness, now checking on the youngest. Hana was 19 years old, a farmer's daughter from Osaka. This was her first time leaving Japan. She had imagined adventure, had dreamed of serving with honor. Instead, she huddled in a frozen hole in the earth, slowly starving to death. Hana whimpered in her sleep, calling for her mother. Akiko stroked her hair gently, making soft shushing sounds. The girl was dying. They were all dying, just some faster than others. 3 of the women could no longer walk. Their feet had turned black with frostbite months ago. The tissue was dead, though the women were too weak to feel much pain anymore. 5 more could barely shuffle each step, agony. Only 7 had enough strength left to attempt any kind of movement. They sang sometimes in the evening, soft melodies about cherry blossoms and spring rain, about mothers waiting and lovers departed. The singing kept them sane, gave them something to focus on besides the gnawing hunger and the cold that seeped into their bones no matter how many layers they wore. But this morning, no one sang. This morning felt different, heavy, final. Because today was the day they had agreed upon. February 18th, 1944, the day of decision. At 9 o'clock in the morning, Akiko gathered the 15 women in a circle. Those who could sit up did so. Those who were too weak remained lying down, but they turned their faces toward her, waiting. She had put this off as long as possible, but they were down to 347 grains of rice, 23 days, and all of them knew they would not last 23 more days. The cold was winning. Starvation was winning. Despair was winning. Akiko pulled the pistol from her coat, a Nambu Type 14. She had hidden it for 9 months, wrapped in cloth, preserved for this moment. 15 bullets carefully hoarded, 1 for each of them. The women looked at the weapon in silence. They had discussed this before, many times, in whispers, in the dark hours before dawn. They knew what their orders had been: death before dishonor, suicide before capture. Better to die by your own hand than face the shame of surrender. We agreed, Akiko said quietly, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. If no rescue by noon today, we use these bullets. She looked around the circle at 15 faces. Faces she had memorized over 274 days. Faces she had kept alive through sheer force of will and careful rationing and always refusing to give up. Keiko was 28, the second oldest after Akiko. She had a son back in Japan, 2 years old when she left. He would be 5 now. She had not seen him since he was a baby. She nodded stoically when Akiko spoke. I am ready, she said simply. Another nurse clutched a photograph worn soft from constant handling. Her husband killed in the initial battle for Atu. She had held his hand as he died, had whispered prayers over his body. She cried silently now, but she too nodded. It is time, she whispered. But when Akiko looked at Hana, the 19-year-old farmer's daughter from Osaka, she saw something different. Terror. Raw animal terror. The kind that came from being young enough to still believe in a future. Akiko Senhana said, her voice small and broken. I have not lived yet. I have done nothing, seen nothing. I do not want to die yet in this hole. The words hung in the frozen air. Akiko felt something crack inside her chest because Hana was right. She was a child. They were all children, really. The oldest was 32, the youngest 19. Some had never been kissed. Some had never fallen in love. Some had barely left their home villages before the military sent them to this frozen hell. Akiko had been trained in duty, in honor, in following orders without question. Her father had been a diplomat, a man who believed absolutely in the rightness of the empire and the emperor. She had grown up with his voice in her head. Death before dishonor, service above self. The individual means nothing. The cause means everything. But looking at Hana's terrified face, Akiko heard a different voice. Her mother's voice. Soft and gentle. They are someone's daughters, Akiko-chan. Someone's precious children. She was supposed to be their commander. Supposed to enforce discipline. Supposed to carry out the final orders and ensure that no one faced the shame of capture. But she was also their nurse. Their caretaker. Their surrogate mother in this frozen hell. And every fiber of her being rebelled against the idea of putting a gun to Hana's head and pulling the trigger. We vote, Akiko heard herself say. The words came out before she fully realized she was speaking. We vote. Those who wish to wait one more day, raise your hand. Silence. Terrible. Heavy silence. The women looked at each other uncertain. This was not the Japanese way. You did not vote on orders. You obeyed. You accepted. You did your duty. Then Hana's hand went up, shaking, tentative. But up, another hand rose, one of the middle-aged nurses. Then another, another. Slowly, like flowers opening to impossible sunlight, 12 hands rose in the frozen air. 12 out of 15. Akiko felt something break inside her, not her will, not her strength, but the wall she had built between herself and her humanity. The wall that allowed her to be a soldier instead of a woman, a commander instead of a nurse, a follower of orders instead of a follower of conscience. One more day, she said softly. We wait one more day. If Americans come, we face that fate together. If rescue comes, we accept it. If nothing changes by sunset tomorrow, we revisit this decision. She did not put the pistol away. She kept it in her lap, heavy and cold, a reminder of the choice that still waited. But for now, for today, they had chosen life. Even if life was nothing but darkness and cold and hunger. Even if life was suffering. They had chosen it. The women began to prepare themselves. It was a ritual they had practiced in their minds. They washed their faces with handfuls of snow, the cold water shocking against their skin. They fixed their hair as best they could with broken combs. They straightened their ragged uniforms, brushing off dirt and ice. We will die with dignity, Akiko said, if we must die. But even as she said the words, she prayed to a God she was no longer sure she believed in. Prayed for rescue, for a miracle, for anything that would let these women see another sunrise. The hours crawled by. 10 o'clock in the morning. 11. The light filtering through cracks in the bunker entrance grew brighter, then began to fade again. Noon approached. Akiko held the pistol in her hands. The metal was so cold it burned her palms. 15 bullets. 15 women. The mathematics of despair. She would shoot the others first, she had decided, starting with the youngest. Quick, clean, merciful, then herself last. She had practiced the motion in her mind. Gun to temple, finger on trigger, a moment of pressure, then nothing. No more cold, no more hunger, no more watching women die slowly in the dark. Her hands shook. She gripped the pistol tighter, trying to stop the trembling. Hana watched her with enormous eyes, tear tracks frozen on her cheeks. "Will it hurt, Akiko-san?" the girl whispered. Akiko opened her mouth to answer, to lie, to say something comforting. That was when they heard it. Voices outside. Male voices. Close. Very close. American voices. The 15 women froze. For a moment, no one breathed. Akiko's finger moved to the trigger of the pistol. This was the moment they had been taught to fear. The moment when the enemy came. When the monsters would do things worse than death. But as the voices grew louder, Akiko heard something unexpected in them. Not rage, not cruelty, just men talking to each other. Casual, almost bored. The sound of soldiers doing a routine job. She made a decision in that instant. A decision that went against every order she had ever received, every belief she had been taught. She put the pistol down, laid it gently on the frozen earth. "No one moves," she whispered to her women. "We wait. We see what they will do." Because even though she had been taught that Americans were monsters, even though the propaganda had filled her head with nightmares, there was a small part of her, the part that was still human, beneath the soldier that whispered a dangerous thought. What if they were wrong? What if the enemy was not what they had been told? What if mercy existed even in war? The voices came closer, the sound of boots crunching in snow, equipment rattling, then a beam of light cut through the darkness, blinding after so long in shadow. Akiko raised one hand to shield her eyes. Behind her, the 14 other women cowered against the back wall of the bunker. The light moved, searching. It fell on faces, on skeletal bodies wrapped in rags, on hollow eyes that had not seen hope in 9 months. A man's voice speaking English. Akiko understood some English from her medical training. Not much, but enough. "Don't shoot. Hold fire." The light steadied. Akiko could see a silhouette behind it. A soldier, American, wearing a heavy coat, holding a rifle that was pointed at the floor, not at them. More figures appeared behind the first. 4 men total, all armed, and all staring at the women with expressions Akiko could not read. Not the expressions she had expected. Not hatred or lust or cruelty. The expressions looked like shock, like disbelief, like something that might have been horror, but not horror at the women themselves. Horror at what had been done to them. Akiko knew she should reach for the pistol, should carry out her orders, should die with honor rather than face what came next. But her hand would not move. Her body would not obey. Because somewhere deep inside, beneath the training and the propaganda and the fear, a tiny spark of hope had ignited. Maybe, just maybe, she and her women would see another sunrise after all. She forced herself to stand, though her legs shook with the effort. Forced herself to step forward into the light. Forced herself to bow, a formal gesture that felt absurd in these circumstances, but was the only thing she knew how to do. When she straightened, she looked at the American soldier who stood closest. He was young, maybe 25, with blue eyes that held something she had not expected to see. Compassion. She spoke the only English words she could remember. Words she had practiced from a medical textbook years ago. Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "We are nurses. Please." Mercy. The word hung in the frozen air between them. Mercy. Such a small word. Such an impossible request. Why would the enemy show mercy? Why would monsters care about 15 dying women? But the young American lowered his rifle completely. His face softened in a way that made Akiko's throat tighten. He looked at her not as an enemy, not as a thing to be killed or captured or used, but as a human being who needed help. "Jesus Christ," one of the other Americans whispered. "They've been here the whole time." Akiko did not understand all the words, but she understood the tone. It was not the tone of monsters. It was the tone of men who had just found something terrible, something that required response. The young American with blue eyes spoke again, his voice gentle. How many? Akiko held up her hands. 10 fingers. Then 5 more. 15. He nodded slowly, then did something that made Akiko's vision blur with sudden tears. He took off his heavy pack, opened it, pulled out a canteen and a wrapped package. He held them out to her. Water, he said, miming drinking. Food. Akiko's hands shook as she took the offerings. Behind her, she heard the soft gasps of her women, heard someone begin to cry, heard Hannah whisper a broken prayer of gratitude. This was not what they had been taught would happen. This was not what the propaganda had promised. The Americans were not monsters. They were not demons. They were men. Just men who saw suffering and responded with kindness. And in that moment, everything Akiko had believed about the war, about the enemy, about honor and shame and duty, began to crack like ice under pressure. The world she thought she understood was shattering around her, and she was left standing in the ruins with a canteen of water in one hand and a package of food in the other, staring at an American soldier who had just chosen mercy when he could have chosen so many other things. Her voice broke as she spoke again, using the only other English word she could remember. Thank you, thank you. And she meant it with every fiber of her being, meant it in a way she had never meant anything before. Because this man, this enemy, this stranger from a country she had been taught to hate, had just given her something more precious than food or water. He had given her hope. He had given her women a chance to live. He had given her a reason to believe that even in the darkest places, even in the frozen hell of war, mercy was still possible. And that mercy, that simple act of human kindness, would echo forward through time in ways none of them could imagine. Through 22 years, through continents and oceans, all the way to a Texas ranch house where an old woman would stand on a porch and say 5 words that carried the weight of a lifetime. You carried me through hell. The young American soldier with the blue eyes was named James Carter, though everyone called him by his first name. He was 24 years old, born in Houston, Texas in 1920. But to understand why he stood in that frozen bunker, offering water to 15 dying Japanese women, when every regulation and every instinct told him to walk away, you have to understand something about where he came from. You have to understand about his grandfather and a cattle ranch outside Austin, and a lesson taught on a hot summer day when James was 8 years old. James Carter stood outside the bunker's entrance now with his team, trying to process what he had just found, trying to reconcile his training with his conscience, trying to figure out what the hell to do. His team consisted of 3 other men, each one different, each one about to face the hardest test of their lives. Sergeant William Donnelly stood to James's right. Everyone called him Bear, and the nickname fit. He was 32 years old, 6'3", built like a bull. He came from Birmingham, Alabama, and he had the slow, measured way of speaking that marked him as a man who thought before he spoke. Bear was a career soldier, had tried for West Point, but his family was too poor for the connections you needed. So he enlisted instead, worked his way up through the ranks through sheer competence and an almost supernatural ability to stay calm under fire. Bear had fought Rommel in North Africa, survived Kasserine Pass where American forces got slaughtered by German armor. He had seen the worst that war could throw at you and come through it with his sanity intact. He was practical, thorough, the kind of NCO who followed regulations because regulations kept soldiers alive. But he also had a soft center he tried to hide. James had seen it once in Tunisia when Bear carried a wounded German soldier 3 miles to a field hospital. The German had been dying. There was no tactical reason to save him, no regulation that required it, but Bear did it anyway, his face set in grim determination, refusing to let the enemy soldier die alone in the sand. Now Bear stood with his rifle held loosely, staring at the bunker entrance where 15 pairs of eyes stared back. His jaw worked silently, calculating, weighing options, trying to find the regulation that covered this situation. To James's left stood Private Daniel Wong, 22 years old, from San Francisco's Chinatown, first-generation Chinese American. His family had fled Shanghai in 1937 when the Japanese invaded. Daniel had been 15 when he watched his mother pack everything they owned into 2 suitcases, when he heard the stories about what Japanese soldiers did in Nanking, when his grandmother refused to leave and later starved to death under occupation. Daniel enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor. Not for America, though he loved his adopted country. He enlisted because the rage inside him needed an outlet, because he wanted to kill the soldiers who had destroyed his family, because revenge burned in his chest like a hot coal that never cooled. He was a good soldier, disciplined, skilled, but James had seen the darkness in him, the way his hands shook when he had to deal with Japanese prisoners, the way his face went blank and cold, the way he sometimes whispered in Cantonese words that sounded like curses or prayers or both. Now Daniel stared at the women in the bunker with an expression James couldn't read. His knuckles were white on his rifle. His jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out like cords. But he hadn't raised his weapon, hadn't made a threatening move. He just stood there, frozen between his training and his hatred and something else. Something that might have been recognition that these women were victims too. The youngest member of the team was Private Patrick O'Malley. Everyone called him Finn. He was 20 years old from the south side of Chicago, Irish Catholic. Grew up in a neighborhood where everybody knew everybody, and the priest knew all your sins before you confessed them. Finn had a girlfriend named Margaret, dark hair, dark eyes, worked at the meatpacking plant where Finn's father worked. They were planning to get married after the war. Finn carried her letters in his breast pocket close to his heart. He read them every night before sleep, lips moving silently over words he had memorized. The letters smelled like lavender water, like home, like a future that seemed very far away on this frozen island dome. Finn was green, still believed in clear lines between good and evil, still thought the war would be like the movies with heroes and villains and everything making sense. He had not yet learned that war turned everything gray, that it made you do things and see things that haunted you forever. Now Finn stared at the Japanese women with wide eyes. His rifle drooped toward the ground. His mouth hung slightly open. He looked like he might cry or vomit or both. Sarge Finn whispered to Bear, "They're just kids. Some of them. They're younger than me." These were the four men: James, Bear, Daniel, Finn. Four very different people thrown together by war, about to make a decision that would define the rest of their lives. James checked his watch. 10:47. Their orders were clear. Check the bunkers, mark them for demolition, return to base by 11:30 before the blizzard hit. The weather report that morning had been unambiguous. Major storm system moving in, wind speeds up to 80 miles per hour, visibility 0, temperature dropping to 20 below, with wind chill approaching 40 below. Anyone caught outside would die. No exceptions. They had 43 minutes to get back to base. The base was 8 miles away across rough terrain. In good weather, it would take 3 hours. In a blizzard, it would be impossible. James looked at the 15 women, looked at their hollow faces and skeletal bodies, looked at the way they huddled together like frightened children. He counted them, noted their condition. 3 could not walk at all, their feet black with advanced frostbite. 5 could barely shuffle. 7 might be able to walk if they had to, though they would not make it far. The mathematics were brutal. 4 men, 15 women, 8 miles, 43 minutes until they needed to be back. 2 hours until the blizzard hit with full force. There was no way, no possible way they could carry 15 women 8 miles through a storm that would kill everyone caught in it. James reached for his radio. They needed to call this in, get orders, let command decide what to do. The radio crackled with static, dead air. He tried adjusting the frequency, tried different channels. Nothing. The cold had killed the batteries, or the mountains were blocking the signal, or some piece of equipment had failed. Didn't matter why. The result was the same. They were alone, no orders, no backup, no one to tell them what to do. Bear stepped close, his voice low so the women couldn't hear. "Carter, we got a problem." "I know. Our orders are clear. Back to base by 11:30. Blizzard's coming. We don't leave now. We don't make it. I know. These women are enemy combatants, military personnel. They're prisoners of war at best. We are not required to risk American lives to save them." "I know, Bear." Bear was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised James. "But we also can't just leave them here to die, can we?" James looked at his sergeant, saw the conflict in Bear's face. The practical soldier warring with the man who once carried a wounded German through the desert. "No," James said quietly, "we can't." Daniel joined them. His face was hard, his voice tight. "They're Japanese. My family. Shanghai. Nanking. You know what they did?" "These women didn't do it," James said. "How do you know?" How do you know they weren't cheering when the news came? How do you know they didn't volunteer to come here and help kill Americans? Don't, James admitted. But look at them, Daniel. Really look. They're victims. Same as your family was. War makes victims of everyone. Daniel's jaw worked. His hands trembled. James could see the war inside him. Hatred against compassion. Revenge against mercy. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice barely audible. If we leave them, I'm no better than the soldiers who killed my uncle. That's what you're saying. That's what I'm saying. Finn appeared at James's elbow. His young face was pale, his eyes too bright. We have to help them, Corporal. We have to. We can't just leave them. We might die if we try. Bear said bluntly. All of us. 4 American soldiers dead trying to save 15 enemy prisoners. That's the math, kid. I don't care about the math. Finn's voice rose. Then he caught himself, lowered it to a fierce whisper. Sir, I look at them, and I see my sisters. I see Margaret. I see somebody's daughter who's going to die if we walk away. How do I live with that? How do I go home and face Margaret and tell her I left women to freeze to death? Because it was the smart play. James felt something settle in his chest. A certainty. It was the feeling he imagined his grandfather had felt standing over that wounded coyote. The feeling of knowing what kind of man you were. He thought about the ranch, about the cowboy code, about his grandfather's words. You help the ones who can't help themselves, even if they're your enemy. Especially if they're your enemy, because that's what separates men from beasts. James looked at Bear, at Daniel, at Finn, his team, his responsibility. We take them, he said. His voice was firm. All of them, now. Bear's eyes widened slightly. Carter, that's impossible. Probably, but we try anyway, the regulations say. I know what the regulations say, Sergeant. I'm giving you a direct order. We are taking these women back to base. All of them, and we're leaving right now. Bear held his gaze for a long moment. Then something shifted in the big man's face. The conflict resolved. He nodded slowly. All right, Corporal, we do it your way, but we do it smart. We fashion stretchers. We distribute weight. We rope everyone together so nobody gets lost in the storm. And we move fast. Daniel stepped forward. His face was still tight, but his hands had stopped shaking. My grandmother used to say something in Cantonese. Rough translation is, revenge is drinking poison and hoping your enemy dies. I've been drinking that poison for 7 years. He looked at the women. Maybe it's time to stop. Finn was already moving, pulling supplies from his pack. What do you need me to do? Sir James felt a surge of gratitude and fear in equal measure. Gratitude that his men were with him. Fear that he might have just sentenced them all to death. But there was no time for doubt now, no time for second guessing. They had maybe 30 minutes before they needed to be moving. 30 minutes to prepare for a journey that would test every limit they had. James turned to the women. The older one, the one who had spoken English, stepped forward. She bowed again, that formal gesture that spoke of discipline and dignity, even in these terrible circumstances. We go? She asked. You take us. We take you, James confirmed. 8 miles to base. In storm. Very dangerous. The woman's eyes filled with tears. She spoke rapidly to the others in Japanese. James heard gasps, heard someone begin to cry, heard what sounded like prayers. The woman turned back to James. Her English was halting, but clear. We trust you, she said. No one left behind. James nodded. No one left behind. He had no idea if that was a promise he could keep. No idea if they would make it even a mile. But he had made his choice. The same choice his grandfather made, kneeling in the Texas dust beside a wounded coyote. The choice to be the kind of man who helped even when it cost everything. Bear was already organizing supplies. They had 2 tent canvases. Broken rifles could serve as poles. Rope to bind it all together. It wouldn't be comfortable, but it would work. 2 women per stretcher, Bear said. Lightest ones. You and me carry 1 Carter. Daniel and the kid take the other. Walking wounded rope together behind us. Finn pulled out their rations. Hardtack biscuits that tasted like cardboard. Chocolate bars frozen solid as rocks. He had to use his rifle butt to break them into pieces. Here, he said, offering food to the nearest woman. It's not much, but... The woman took the piece of chocolate with shaking hands, held it like it was made of gold, put it in her mouth and closed her eyes. Tears ran down her hollow cheeks. James watched as his men shared everything they had. Watched Finn break apart his own rations and distribute them equally. Watched Daniel help one of the women to her feet, his touch gentle despite the conflict in his eyes. Watched Bear fashion stretchers with the efficient movements of a man who had done field medicine and combat. The older Japanese woman, the nurse, moved through her group, organizing, speaking rapid Japanese, creating order from chaos. James was impressed by her leadership, by the way the other women responded to her despite their weakness. She was keeping them together through sheer force of will. She approached James, held out her hand. "Akiko," she said, pointing to herself. "Akiko Tanaka." "James Carter," he replied. "People call me James." James, Akiko repeated carefully. Then she said something in Japanese, gesturing to her women, then to him and his men. She placed her hands together as if in prayer. James didn't need a translator. He understood. "Thank you. We are grateful. We will follow you." He checked his watch. 11:18. 12 minutes until they were supposed to be back at base. The sky outside had grown darker. The wind was picking up. Snow had started to fall, light flakes dancing in the air. Soon those flakes would become a wall of white. James stepped outside the bunker entrance and looked at the scumming, looked at the gathering storm, calculated the odds. They were impossible. Mathematically, logically, practically impossible. But he had not made this decision based on math or logic or practicality. He had made it based on something his grandfather taught him on a hot Texas day when the world was simple and the only question was whether to help a wounded coyote. He made it because of who he was, who he chose to be. Behind him, he heard Bear organizing the carry teams, heard Daniel speaking quietly to the women in broken Japanese, trying to explain what they were about to do. Heard Finn's nervous laughter as he helped someone into a makeshift coat. 4 American soldiers, 15 Japanese women, 8 miles through hell. A storm that would kill anyone caught in it. Odds that no sane person would take. But they were going to try anyway, because sometimes the measure of a man wasn't in the smart choice or the safe choice or the choice that made sense. Sometimes it was in the choice that cost everything but saved your soul. James took a deep breath of the cold air, felt the wind on his face, felt the weight of what was coming. "All right," he called to his team. "Time to move. We've got 8 miles and a whole lot of hell between us and home. Let's do this." And with those words, 4 men and 15 women stepped out into the beginning of the worst blizzard in Atu's history. Stepped out into a journey that would test them beyond anything they had ever imagined. Stepped out into a story that would echo through decades. A story about mercy, about choosing humanity over expedience. About 4 men who decided that some things mattered more than survival. The storm was waiting. They had been walking for exactly 23 minutes when the world turned white and deadly. One moment James could see perhaps 50 yards ahead. The next moment he could see nothing. The blizzard hit like a physical force, a wall of wind and snow that slammed into them with the violence of an explosion. The temperature, already brutal at 20 below zero, plummeted further. Wind that had been merely strong became something monstrous. Gusts reaching 70-80 miles per hour, strong enough to knock a grown man off his feet. James felt the woman on his back tighten her grip around his neck. She was one of 3 women they were carrying individually. Akiko had insisted on being carried by James. "I lead my women," she had said. "I stay where I can see them." Behind him, Bear and Daniel bore a stretcher between them, with 2 women lying side by side, the lightest of the group. Hana and Keiko, barely conscious, wrapped in every spare piece of cloth they could find. Finn carried a second stretcher when his rotation came. Every 10 minutes, they switched positions, passing the burden between them. It was the only way any of them could continue. The 8 remaining women who could still walk followed roped together. Akiko had organized them before they left the bunker, the strongest in front and back, the weakest in the middle, a human chain stumbling through hell. 4 soldiers, 15 women, 7 being carried, 8 walking. The mathematics of survival made brutal by the storm. The woman on James's back was small, maybe 85 pounds. But in this cold, with this wind, she felt twice that weight. Her breath came in shallow gasps against his ear. Each exhalation, a tiny cloud of vapor that froze instantly into ice crystals. He could feel her shivering against him. violent tremors that shook her entire frame. The snow came at them horizontally, driven by winds so fierce it turned each flake into a tiny needle. James's face went numb within seconds. Ice formed in his eyebrows, his mustache coating his skin in a frozen mask. His hands, even inside thick gloves, began to lose feeling. This was how people died on Etu. Not from bullets, but from cold that crept in degree by degree and stole life one breath at a time. Before leaving the bunker, James had roped everyone together in a human chain. It was the only way to keep from being separated in conditions like these. The rope ran from James at the front back through Bear Daniel, Finn Akiko's walking wounded, each woman connected to the next. If anyone fell, the rope would hold them. If anyone got lost, the tension would tell him. Now that rope was the only thing keeping them alive. James could not see Bear directly behind him, could not see anyone beyond the wall of white. He could only feel the rope's tension, could only trust that everyone was still there, still moving, still breathing. The snow was knee-deep in some places, waist-deep where it had drifted. Each step required James to lift his leg, high punch through the crust, find solid ground beneath. His thighs burned, his calves screamed, his lungs could not seem to get enough air. The atmosphere on Atu was thin to begin with. Add in the exertion and the cold air searing his throat with each breath, and he felt like he was drowning in the middle of a frozen desert. After 15 minutes in the storm, James's sense of direction began to fail. The compass was useless, the needle spinning wildly in the magnetic chaos of the weather. He was navigating by instinct now, by some primitive sense of direction that might be leading them straight or might be walking them in circles. The fear was a cold weight in his stomach, heavier than the woman on his back. If they were lost, they would die. All of them. 19 bodies found in spring, frozen solid, roped together in their final moments. James forced the thought away, forced himself to focus on the next step. Just the next step. Nothing beyond that. Left foot, right foot, breathe, left foot, right foot, breathe, make it a rhythm, make it automatic. Do not think about the 7.5 miles still to go. Do not think about the odds. Just step and step and step. Behind him, Bear Donnelly and Daniel Wong bore the first stretcher between them. Two women lay on the canvas so light from starvation that their combined weight felt like carrying a single healthy person. But the awkwardness of the load, the way it caught the wind like a sail, made every step a battle. Bear's shoulders were on fire. His back felt like it was breaking. He had carried wounded men before, in North Africa, through the Sahara heat that killed as efficiently as any bullet. He had thought that was the worst environment imaginable. He had been wrong. The cold was worse. In the desert, you died quickly, heat stroke taking you in hours. Here, death was slow, insidious, creeping. The cold got into your bones and made you want to sleep, made it seem like rest was the answer. But rest was death, and Bear knew it. His mind went back to Tunisia, June 1943, the aftermath of Kasserine Pass. He had found a German soldier lying in the sand, gut shot, dying, no more than 20 years old. Blonde hair, blue eyes wide with pain and fear. Bear could have walked past, could have put a bullet in the boy's head as a mercy, could have let the desert do its work. Instead, he knelt beside the enemy soldier. The German looked up at him, saw the American uniform. His eyes filled with terror. Bear pulled out his canteen, held it to the boy's lips. "Drink," he said, even though the German probably didn't understand English. The soldier drank, tears running down his dusty cheeks. "Mutti," he whispered. "Mutti, mother." Even in German, Bear understood. He hoisted the boy in a fireman's carry, 140 pounds of dying enemy, and he walked 3 miles across sand that burned through the soles of his boots, under a sun that turned the sky white with heat. His canteen ran dry after the first mile. He kept walking. The German soldier cried and called for his mother, and sometimes went silent in a way that made Bear think he was already dead. But then the boy would gasp, and the crying would start again. When Bear finally reached the American field hospital, the medics looked at him like he was insane. "You carried a German," one of them asked. For 3 miles, Bear didn't answer, just laid the boy down as gently as he could. The German soldier opened his eyes one last time, looked at Bear, whispered a single word, "Danke, thank you." Then he died, right there on the hospital table. 10 minutes after Bear saved him from dying alone in the sand. The medic had shaken his head. "You risked heat stroke for nothing," he said. Kid was dead anyway. But Bear didn't think it was nothing, because in that moment, carrying an enemy through the desert, he had proven something to himself, that he was more than just a soldier following orders, that he could choose compassion over convenience, that he could see the enemy as human. Now carrying Hana and Keiko through the blizzard, Bear felt that same certainty. If I left them, he thought I'd be no different than those who let that boy die in the sand. The wind gusted, nearly ripped the stretcher from his hands. Bear adjusted his grip, muscles screaming. "We keep them alive," he whispered to Daniel. "No matter what." Daniel nodded. He couldn't speak, saving his breath for walking. But his face showed the war still raging inside him. Daniel Wong stared at the two women on the stretcher. Hana, 19 years old, and Keiko, 28, a mother with a son she hadn't seen in 2 years. They reminded him of his family, of the people he'd lost. His mind went back to Shanghai. December 1937, he was 15 years old. The Japanese army had entered the city. News from Nanking was arriving, stories of massacres, of atrocities, of horrors beyond imagination. Daniel's family was packing, 2 suitcases for 5 people, everything they owned condensed into 120 pounds of belongings. His grandmother refused to leave. "This is my home," she said. "I was born in this house. I will die in this house. I will not abandon it." Daniel's mother begged, pleaded, wept. But the old woman was stubborn, defiant, certain that the occupation would end, that things would return to normal, that she would be fine. The family left without her, sailed to San Francisco, started over in Chinatown. The letters came for 6 months, grandmother writing about the occupation, about food shortages, about Japanese soldiers in the streets, about fear. Then the letter stopped. March 1938, no word. Daniel's mother wrote every week, sent packages, received nothing back. In 1939, a neighbor who had fled later brought news. "Your mother starved to death," he told Daniel's mother. "The Japanese confiscated all the food. She had nothing. No one helped her. She died alone in that house, just like she said she would." Daniel's mother didn't speak for 6 months after that, just moved through the apartment like a ghost, cooking, cleaning, crying when she thought no one could hear. But Daniel heard. He absorbed her grief, her rage, her hatred. It became his fuel, his purpose, his reason for enlisting the day after Pearl Harbor. He wanted to kill Japanese soldiers, wanted to make them pay for what they did to his grandmother, to his family, to his mother's heart. For 7 years, that rage had burned in his chest like a hot coal, never cooling, never dimming. But now, looking at Keiko's face gaunt and hollow from starvation, Daniel saw something he didn't want to see: his grandmother. This is what she must have looked like, he thought, in those final days, starving, alone, forgotten. Keiko's eyes fluttered open, met Daniel's through the swirling snow. She didn't have the strength to focus, didn't recognize him as American or enemy or human, just shapes moving through white. But something passed between them anyway. A recognition deeper than nationality, deeper than war. Suffering recognizes suffering. Daniel's hands tightened on the stretcher. "I won't let you die," he thought. He didn't know if the promise was to Keiko or to his grandmother's memory. Maybe both. For the first time since enlisting, Daniel prayed, in Cantonese, the language of his grandmother. "Po po," he whispered into the wind. "If you can hear me, I'm carrying one of them, the ones who took you from us. But she's dying, and I can't let her die. Because if I do, I'm no better than they were. Is that right, Papa? Tell me I'm right." No answer came but the wind, but Daniel felt something shift inside him, a small release, like poison draining from a wound. Revenge is drinking poison and hoping your enemy dies. His grandmother had said that once, before the war, before the occupation, when the world was simpler. For 7 years, Daniel had been drinking that poison. Maybe he thought maybe it's time to stop. 1 hour into the storm, Finn O'Malley's body began to fail. He had been carrying an individual woman on rotation for 20 minutes straight, the third woman who could not walk, unconscious from hypothermia, dead weight on his shoulders. Finn was 20 years old, the youngest of the team, the least experienced. His body was giving out. His thighs burned like someone had poured acid into the muscles. His lungs couldn't get enough air. His vision was tunneling, graying at the edges. His mind started to drift. He thought of Margaret, her letters, the smell of lavender water, the plans they'd made, the apartment they would rent on the south side. 2 bedrooms, close to his parents. Walking distance to the parish church where they'd get married. Father Murphy would perform the ceremony. Margaret's mother would cry. His father would get drunk at the reception and embarrass everyone with toasts. They'd have children, 3, maybe 4. Irish Catholic families were big families. Margaret wanted to name the first boy Patrick after Finn, the first girl Mary after her grandmother. Finn could see it all so clearly, could feel Margaret's hand in his, could hear the sound of children laughing in their apartment. It felt so real, so close. And then his legs simply stopped working. No warning, no gradual weakening. They just gave out. Finn dropped into the snow like someone had cut his strings. The woman he was carrying tumbled forward. Daniel lunged, caught the stretcher before the women could fall. The rope went slack. James felt the tension change, turned. He could barely see through the snow, just shapes, movement. Finn down, Daniel holding a stretcher alone, Bear moving back to help. James forced himself over to the younger soldier. Finn lay in the snow, eyes glazed, lips blue, not responding. This was hypothermia. Stage 2, maybe stage 3, the body shutting down, core temperature dropping below 95 degrees. If Finn didn't get up, he would die. Right here. Right now. James got in the younger man's face. What he was about to do would haunt him later, but it was necessary, the only thing that would work. His voice cut through the storm, hard, cold, deliberate. Patrick O'Malley, 20 years old, Southside Chicago. Finn's eyes flickered, hearing something. Girlfriend Margaret Kelly, dark hair, works meat packing plant with your dad. Finn's mouth moved. No sound. You showed me her picture. Told me you're going to marry her after the war. Told me about the apartment, the kids you want. Finn was focusing now, coming back from wherever hypothermia had taken him. So here's what's going to happen, Private. You're going to get up. You're going to keep moving. You know why? James leaned closer, made his voice hard as iron. Because if you don't, you die here, in this frozen hell. And Margaret gets a letter. Dear Miss Kelly, we regret to inform you Private Patrick O'Malley died February 18th, 1944. He gave up. He quit. He sat down and refused to keep going. Finn's face twisted, rage sparking in his eyes. Is that what you want? Want Margaret crying at your wake? Want her wondering why you weren't strong enough? Want her to spend her life thinking you gave up? Finn's eyes focused. The rage burned through the hypothermia like fire through ice. He spoke for the first time, a word James had never heard him use. Fuck you, Corporal. James almost smiled. Good. Now get on your feet. Finn struggled up, swaying, grabbing the rope with hands that could barely feel. He took the stretcher back from Daniel, adjusted his grip. Through gritted teeth, he said, I'm not dying here. No, James said. You're not. Now move. And Finn moved, fueled by rage, by shame, by the image of Margaret reading that letter, by the determination not to be the man who gave up. They continued, somehow, impossibly, finding strength they didn't know they had. Hour 2 in the storm brought hallucinations. James's brain, starved of oxygen and warmth, began to fracture reality. He saw lights ahead, buildings that didn't exist, heard voices calling his name that were just wind. His mother appeared in the snow, arms open, beckoning him home. Come rest, James. You've done enough. Come home. He saw his grandfather standing by a barn, the coyote with the broken leg limping beside him. You did good, boy. You can stop now. He saw the ranch, summer heat, the smell of bacon frying in the kitchen, cattle lowing in the distance, everything warm and safe and home. The visions were so real, so vivid, so tempting. Just stop walking. Just rest. Just close your eyes. James shook his head violently, trying to clear the hallucinations, but they kept coming. He started reciting facts, anchoring himself to reality. My name is James Carter, from Houston, Texas, 24 years old. carrying Japanese nurse Akiko. 8 miles to base. Will not give up. Will not die here. Over and over. A mantra against madness. Akiko whispered something against his ear. Japanese words he didn't understand. But her voice was real. Human. Alive. He focused on it. Used it as an anchor. Her breath, her heartbeat, her weight on his back. These things were real. The rest was dying brain cells lying to him. Behind him, the team was deteriorating. Bear stumbled badly, caught himself before falling, but his face had gone white with frostbite. The skin on his cheeks turning that pale color that meant permanent tissue damage. But he kept moving, machine-like, determined. Daniel had stopped speaking 30 minutes ago, just followed the rope like an automaton. But his grip on the stretcher remained iron-tight. Finn moved on pure rage now, jaw clenched, every step in angry defiance, thinking of Margaret, of the letter he refused to let her receive. The 8 walking wounded behind them were barely conscious. 2 had to be supported by the others. All were hypothermic, but they were still moving, following their leader. Akiko checked them during the brief moments when James paused to adjust his grip, her cold fingers finding pulses, counting beats, whispering encouragement in Japanese. Still alive. Keep moving. We survived together. 2 hours into the journey, disaster struck again. One of the women on the first stretcher simply stopped responding. Hana, the 19-year-old farmer's daughter from Osaka. Her eyes rolled back. Her body went completely limp. Bear and Daniel stopped, laid the stretcher down as gently as they could in the howling wind. Bear checked for a pulse. His fingers were so numb it took 3 tries. But he found it. Faint, rapid, fluttering like a trapped bird trying to escape. She was alive, but unconscious. Severe hypothermia shutting her body down piece by piece. Core temperature probably 85 degrees, maybe lower. Below 82, the heart would stop. Finn said what they were all thinking. We have to leave her. The words hung in the frozen air. We're already at our limit. We can't carry another individual. If we try, we all die. Bear's face was grim. Kid's right, Carter. We're barely holding on. Add more individual weight, none of us make it. James looked at unconscious Hana, 19 years old, whole life ahead of her. Looked at Akiko on his back, watching, testing him. Looked at his men, exhausted, at their breaking point. Looked at the mathematics. Impossible. Finn was right about the odds. Bear was right about the logic. But James heard his grandfather's voice. A man's character is measured by who he helps when it costs everything. This moment cost everything. Save her and they might all die. Leave her and they save 18, but lose their souls. James made his choice. He bent down, hoisted unconscious Hana over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. The woman already on his back, Akiko shifted. Her arms tightened around his neck, trying to make herself lighter somehow. Now James was carrying 2. Akiko on his back, arms around his neck, Hana over his shoulder. Dead weight, combined weight 170 pounds. It should have dropped him immediately. Instead, James straightened, adjusted his grip, found his balance, took 1 step, then another. Bear watched with something like awe. Then he nodded slowly. 10 minutes, then my turn. We rotate. Daniel stepped forward. The conflict finally resolved in his eyes. Count me in. Even Finn nodded. We've come this far, not leaving anyone now. And so they established a new system. Every 10 minutes, they rotated the unconscious woman between them. James carried both women from 2 o'clock to 2:10. Bear took Hana at 2:10. James kept Akiko. Daniel at 2:20. Finn at 2:30. Repeat. Each rotation was agony. Each handoff was a small miracle. Transferring an unconscious woman without dropping her in the snow, without stopping long enough to freeze. Akiko checked Hana's pulse at every rotation. Cold fingers found the vein at the wrist, counted beats, looked up at whoever was carrying, held up fingers to indicate heart rate, then nodded. Alive. Still alive. That nod became the most important thing in James's universe. It meant their choice mattered. It meant Hana was still breathing. It meant mercy was still possible. It meant they were not just saving her. They were saving themselves. proving that humanity could survive even in hell. Hour 3 brought them beyond normal human limits. James couldn't feel his feet anymore. His legs moved by muscle memory. His vision was gray around the edges. His hearing reduced to only the deafening white noise of wind. Bare shoulders were grinding bone on bone. Frostbite had claimed his nose, ears, and cheeks, permanent damage, scars he would carry the rest of his life. But he wouldn't let go of the stretcher. Daniel's hands had turned blue-black, severe frostbite. He would lose at least 2 fingers later, maybe 3, but his grip never loosened. Finn, the youngest, had become the toughest. Rage transformed into pure determination. Margaret's face keeping him moving. The letter he refused to let her receive fueling every step. The walking wounded behind them were beyond exhaustion, beyond pain, moving on some primal instinct to survive. And then through the swirling snow, James saw it. A building, dark, angular, man-made, maybe 200 yards ahead. The supply depot, edge of base perimeter. Relief flooded through him so intense it was almost painful. His legs nearly gave out. Tears froze on his cheeks. We made it, he thought, against all odds, against every probability. We made it. But he forced himself to keep moving, to close the final distance, to finish what they started. The last 200 yards were the hardest of all. His body knew safety was close, wanted to collapse now, but he couldn't, not yet. One step, another, another. The woman on his back, Akiko, whispered something. He couldn't hear the words, but he felt the emotion. Gratitude, disbelief, hope. Behind him, 18 others followed, all roped together, all still alive, all about to reach impossible salvation. Private Thompson stood guard at the depot door. He saw them emerge from the storm. Walking corpses covered in ice and snow, barely recognizable as human. His rifle came up. Down. Up again. His mouth fell open. What the hell? James's voice came out as barely a croak. Get medics, now, blankets, hot water, coffee, everything. Move. Thompson ran inside. They collapsed. James gently lowered both women from his back and shoulder. For a moment, he thought his legs wouldn't support him without their weight. He locked his knees, forced himself to stand, couldn't show weakness. Not yet. Not until everyone was safe. Bear and Daniel set down their stretcher with similar care. The 2 women on it barely conscious but alive. Hearts beating. Finn laid down his stretcher. All 4 women on both stretchers breathing. The walking wounded stumbled the final steps. Akiko immediately began checking her women, crawling from person to person despite her own exhaustion. Pulse, breath, pupils, professional assessment, even in extremis. After checking unconscious Hana, she looked up at James and smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile. It transformed her face. She lives, Akiko said. You saved her. You saved us all. The medics arrived within 2 minutes, professionals who had seen everything war could throw at them. But even they looked shocked. Severe hypothermia, advanced frostbite, malnutrition, dehydration. One medic, Sergeant Williams, examined Akiko and shook his head in disbelief. Ma'am, your core temperature is 89 degrees. You should be dead. Akiko looked at him with steady eyes. Death is easy, she said clearly. Living is hard. We choose hard. The medics worked quickly. Blankets first, warming slowly to avoid shock. Warm liquids administered carefully. IV lines for the worst cases. All 15 nurses would lose fingers or toes, some worse. But they would live. That was what mattered. They would live. James wanted to sit, to close his eyes, to sleep for a week. But he remained standing. His men needed him. The women needed him. He could rest when everyone was safe. 30 minutes later, Colonel Frank Mitchell arrived. He stood in the doorway of the depot, surveying the scene. 4 of his soldiers barely conscious. 15 enemy women being treated by his medics. The worst blizzard of the year still raging outside. He pulled James aside. His face was unreadable. Corporal Carter, what happened out there? James told him everything. The discovery, the decision, the journey, every detail. He didn't try to justify it, didn't make excuses. He had made his choice. He would live with the consequences. Mitchell listened without interrupting. When James finished, the commander was silent for a long moment. The only sound was the wind howling outside and the quiet voices of medics working. Finally, Mitchell spoke. "Let me make sure I understand correctly, Corporal. You discovered 15 enemy prisoners in condition requiring immediate medical attention. You were ordered to return to base by 11:30 before the blizzard arrived. Instead, you disobeyed direct orders and carried 15 enemy combatants 8 miles through the worst blizzard on record. You risked 4 American lives to save them. Is that accurate?" James swallowed hard. This was it. Court-martial, disobeying orders, risking American lives. "Yes, sir." Mitchell looked at him for a long moment, then at the women being treated, then back at James. Something shifted in the commander's expression. Something that might have been respect, or understanding, or simple recognition of what it meant to be human. "Good," Mitchell said finally. "That's exactly what you should have done." James blinked. Had he heard correctly? Mitchell continued, "I'll be recommending you and your men for commendations. Bronze Star minimum, possibly Silver Star. What you did out there was heroic, not because you fought the enemy, but because you saved them. That's the kind of men I want in my command. Men who remember what we're fighting for." He paused. "We're not fighting to be like them. We're fighting to be better than them. And today, Corporal, you prove we are better." Mitchell turned to leave, then paused. "Get some rest. Your men too. That's an order." He looked back one more time. "And Carter, your grandfather would be proud." James wanted to ask how the colonel knew about his grandfather, but Mitchell was already gone. James sat against the wall. Adrenaline crashed. Exhaustion hit like a physical blow. He was asleep before his head touched the wood. He dreamed of Texas. Summer heat. His grandfather working with horses. A coyote with a healed leg watching from a ridge. All of it warm, safe, home. He woke 18 hours later to find that he and his men had been awarded Bronze Stars, that all 15 nurses would survive, that his choice, the impossible choice, had mattered. But the true measure of that choice wouldn't be known for 22 more years. Not until a spring day in 1966, when an old Japanese woman would stand on a Texas porch holding a photograph and say 5 words that carried the weight of a lifetime. "You carried me through hell." The storm outside continued to rage. But inside the depot, 19 souls rested. Warm for the first time in 9 months. Safe for the first time since the battle. And 4 men slept knowing they had chosen mercy over mathematics, humanity over expedience, life over death. They had walked 8 miles through hell and brought everyone home. Not because it was smart, not because it was safe, not because it made sense, but because that's what it means to be human. That's the cowboy code. That's the Texas way. That's the choice that echoes through generations. The Japanese nurses spent 3 weeks recovering at the base hospital on Attu. It was a strange time, a disorienting time, a time that shattered everything they had been taught about the enemy. The medical staff treated them with the same care they gave to American soldiers. Warm beds with clean sheets, hot food that came in portions they could barely comprehend after 9 months of starvation. Medicine, bandages, kindness. The women had been taught that Americans were subhuman, that capture meant torture and death, that shame was worse than dying, that surrender was the ultimate dishonor. Yet here they were, given warmth, given food, given dignity. Every act of kindness was a hammer blow to the foundation of their beliefs. Akiko struggled most with this contradiction. She had been a true believer in the imperial cause, had volunteered for Attu, knowing it was likely a death sentence, had been willing to pull the trigger on 15 women, including herself, rather than face capture. But American treatment was destroying her certainty piece by piece. One day, an American nurse brought her a cup of real coffee. The nurse's name was Anna Morrison, 28 years old. From Minnesota, blonde hair pulled back in a practical bun, blue eyes that held warmth instead of hatred. Anna had been assigned to care for the Japanese prisoners, but she didn't see enemies. She saw patients, women who needed help. She brought Akiko the coffee on the 7th day of recovery. Not the bitter substitutes they had endured for years in Japan. Actual coffee made from real beans. The smell alone was overwhelming. A sensory memory of life before war, of normalcy, of civilization. Akiko held the cup in both hands, felt the warmth seep into her cold fingers, cold that had lived in her bones for 9 months and refused to leave even now in a heated building. She brought the cup to her lips. The first sip was bitter but good, complex flavors dancing on her tongue. Real, authentic, honest. And then Akiko began to cry. Not quiet tears, deep wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. Years of pain pouring out. Years of holding everything together. Of being strong for her women. Of watching them starve. Of counting rice grains. Of preparing to shoot them all rather than let them face capture. Of believing lies. She cried for the 274 days in darkness. For the women who had died before rescue came. For Hana, 19 years old, who had almost died because Akiko had been seconds away from pulling a trigger. She cried for everything she had believed, everything that had been proven false. They told her Americans were monsters, demons, subhuman creatures who would do unspeakable things. But monsters don't carry their enemies through blizzards. Monsters don't share their coffee. Monsters don't show mercy. Anna Morrison sat beside her, said nothing, didn't try to comfort with words, didn't ask what was wrong, didn't judge or question or demand. She just sat, one hand on Akiko's shoulder, offering the simple gift of human companionship. That simple act broke something in Akiko. Some wall she had built between herself and the world, between soldier and woman, between duty and humanity. For the first time since the war began, she allowed herself to feel, to grieve, to question, to wonder if everything she had been taught was a lie. And sitting in that hospital room holding a cup of coffee, given by an enemy who showed only kindness, Akiko's transformation began. The younger nurses adjusted more quickly, less entrenched in ideology, more flexible in their thinking. Youth gave them resilience. They learned English phrases from the American staff. Thank you. Please, good morning. How are you today? They marveled at the abundance. Food that came in endless supply. Heat that worked every day without fail. Clean water from taps. Soap. Toothpaste. Things Americans took for granted seemed miraculous to women who had lived in a frozen bunker eating 7 grains of rice per day. Hana, the 19-year-old who had lost 3 toes to frostbite, told an American medic through a translator, "In Japan, we were told you were monsters, that you would defile us, torture us, kill us in terrible ways. But monsters do not carry their enemies through blizzards. Monsters do not share their food when they are hungry too. I do not know what you are, but you are not monsters." The medic, a young man from Iowa, didn't know how to respond to that. He just nodded and said, "We're just doing our jobs, ma'am." But it was more than a job, and everyone knew it. James visited once during the recovery period, March 5th, 1944, 2 weeks after the rescue. He felt awkward, uncomfortable, didn't know what to say. What do you say to people you saved? What words cover carrying someone through hell? He stood in the doorway of the hospital ward, hands in pockets, clean uniform feeling strange after weeks in the field. His frostbite was healing. The doctor said he'd been lucky. No permanent damage, just pain and numbness that would fade with time. When Akiko saw him, she immediately stood, bowed deeply. The other nurses followed. Those who could stand did so. Others bowed from their beds, a wave of formal Japanese gratitude washing through the room. James waved them off, embarrassed. "Please don't. You don't need to do that." But Akiko straightened, looked him in the eye. Her English had improved remarkably in just 2 weeks. "You saved us," she said, "not because we are American, not because we are friends. You saved us because we are human. That is everything. That is what makes you different, better." She took a step closer. Her voice dropped but didn't lose its intensity. "You could have left us. The cold would have done your work. No one would have blamed you. But you chose mercy, and mercy is the hardest choice of all." James didn't know how to respond. He mumbled something about just doing his duty, about following orders, about it being the right thing. The words felt inadequate even as he said them. He left quickly, face burning, uncomfortable with praise, with gratitude, with being seen as a hero when he just felt like a man who had made a choice. But Akiko's words stayed with him. Mercy is the hardest choice of all. That night, sitting in the barracks with Bear Daniel and Finn James, finally voiced the question that had been haunting him. Did we do the right thing? The question hung in the air, heavy, uncertain. They were the enemy. James continued. We could have died. All of us. Did we risk American lives for people who were trying to kill us a year ago? Does that make sense? Bear looked up from the knife he was sharpening. The rhythmic sound of stone on steel stopped. Yeah, we did the right thing, Bear said, his Alabama drawl slow and measured. I'll tell you why. Because if we'd left them, we'd be no different from the bastards we're fighting. What makes us different isn't our guns or bombs or ships or planes. It's that we don't leave people to die in the snow, even if they're the enemy, especially if they're the enemy, because showing mercy to someone who doesn't deserve it, that's what separates humans from animals. Daniel nodded slowly, looking at his bandaged hand. 3 fingers gone, the stump still healing. My family suffered under the Japanese, Daniel said quietly. I have every reason to hate them. And I do, I hate what they did. But those women didn't do it. They were just trying to survive like us. If I'd left them to die, I'd be no better than the soldiers who killed my uncle in Shanghai. Revenge is easy. Forgiveness is hard. But hard things are what make us human. Finn spoke last, his voice quieter than usual. I wanted to leave that last woman when she collapsed. Hannah, I thought this is where we cut our losses. This is where we save ourselves. I'm ashamed of that now because you wouldn't let me, Corporal. You made me be better than I wanted to be. You taught me that our better nature isn't something we have naturally. It's something we choose. And sometimes we need someone to remind us to make that choice. James felt something settle in his chest, a peace he hadn't known he needed. They had done the right thing, the hard thing, the thing that cost them everything but saved their souls. And that was enough. The nurses were eventually transferred to a prisoner of war camp on the mainland. Before they left, they insisted on saying goodbye. It was a formal ceremony. The nurses lined up in the hospital ward. Each one, even those in wheelchairs or on crutches, participated. They bowed to each soldier. Deep, respectful bows that spoke of gratitude beyond words. They gave small gifts. Origami cranes folded from medical paper. Tiny carved charms made from driftwood they had found on the island. A song sung in beautiful, haunting Japanese that brought tears to eyes that had seen too much war. Akiko pressed an origami crane into James's hand. The folds were perfect, delicate, a thing of beauty created in hell. You gave me life, she said, her English clear now. Practiced, I can never repay, but I will remember. Always, I will teach my children about the American soldier who carried me through snow. I will tell them that enemies can become friends, that mercy is stronger than hate, that one man's choice can change everything. She bowed once more. James, awkward as always, with emotion, bowed back. It seemed the right thing to do. The war ended. Everyone went home. Akiko returned to Japan in 1946. The country was devastated. Tokyo bombed into rubble. The economy destroyed. Millions dead or displaced. Shame and defeat hanging over everything like a cloud. Being a former prisoner of war carried its own shame in post-war Japanese culture. Most former prisoners hid their history, changed their names, moved to new cities where no one knew them, tried to forget. But Akiko was different. She became a nurse again, worked in hospitals treating both Japanese and American patients during the occupation. A controversial choice. Many Japanese refused to work with the occupiers, saw it as continued betrayal. But Akiko didn't care what they thought. I am alive today because of American kindness, she told her family. I will never forget. In 1948, she gave birth to a daughter, and she did something that scandalized her entire family. She named the baby Anna after Nurse Anna Morrison, the American nurse who had given her coffee, who had sat with her while she cried, who had shown her that the enemy could be kind. An American name for a Japanese child. It was unthinkable, disgraceful, a slap in the face to tradition and honor. Akiko's father refused to speak to her for 2 years. Her mother wept. Her siblings were mortified, but Akiko held firm. I am alive because of American mercy, she said. My daughter will carry that memory in her name. She will know that enemies can become friends, that kindness can cross any border. That one act of compassion can echo through generations. She kept a diary, tiny characters written on scraps of paper, recording everything. The 274 days in the bunker, the starvation math, the vote to live, the Americans arriving at 11:47, 13 minutes before the suicide deadline, the blizzard, the mercy, the coffee that made her cry, the transformation of everything she believed. She passed the diary to Anna when her daughter was old enough to understand, maybe 12 or 13 years old. This is your inheritance, Akiko told her daughter. Not money, not property, the story of mercy, the story of why you have an American name, the story of why you exist. Anna read the diary and wept, for the suffering her mother had endured, for the choice that had saved her, for the debt that could never be repaid but must always be remembered. I want to meet him, Anna said, the soldier who carried you, the one who gave you life. Someday, Akiko promised, when the time is right. James returned to Texas in 1946, but not to Houston, where his father worked in a factory, not to the city where he had grown up. He went back to the land, to the hill country outside Fredericksburg, to the place where his grandfather had taught him about wounded coyotes and what it means to be a man. He bought 50 acres, a piece of the old ranch, enough for a few head of cattle, some quarter horses, a small house, a barn, enough to remember who he was. He married Marie, a girl from town, daughter of a German immigrant family that had settled in Fredericksburg 3 generations back. She had dark hair and a practical manner, and she didn't ask too many questions about the war. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. James never sought recognition for what happened on a 2. His Bronze Star sat in a drawer. He didn't attend veteran reunions, didn't talk about the war except when directly asked. But in 1955, his children asked the question that every veteran's children eventually ask. Dad, what did you do in the war? James thought for a long time. He was sitting on the porch, the sun setting over the hill country, cattle lowing in the distance, the smell of mesquite smoke from a neighbor's barbecue drifting on the evening air. Finally, he told them about February 18, 1944, about 15 nurses in a bunker, about a blizzard, about choosing mercy when mathematics said to walk away, about what his grandfather had taught him with a wounded coyote. His children never forgot. The story shaped who they became, how they treated others, what they believed about enemies and kindness and the choices that define a life. Bear returned to Birmingham, Alabama in 1947. He became a high school teacher. History and civics. Every year when he taught about World War II, he made February 18, 1944, the centerpiece of the unit. Not battles, not strategy, not the big names and famous victories, but the day 4 men carried 15 women through a blizzard, the day mercy triumphed over hate. He told his students about the choice, about the mathematics, about how sometimes the right thing and the smart thing aren't the same thing. And when that happens, you have to decide what kind of person you are. Former students decades later would write to him, Mr. Donnelly, your story changed my life, made me think differently about enemies, about what it means to be human. Bear kept those letters in a box, read them sometimes when he wondered if teaching mattered, if anything he did made a difference. The letters told him it did. Daniel worked as a translator after the war, Japanese to English, helping rebuild Japan, United States relations during the occupation and after. His family couldn't understand. Why would you work with the people who killed grandmother? Why would you help them? Daniel would hold up his hand, 3 fingers missing, the scars white against his skin. Because someone showed me that revenge is drinking poison and hoping your enemy dies, he said. I drank that poison for 7 years. It almost killed me. Not my body, my soul. And then I had to choose. Keep drinking or let it go. I chose to let it go. His grandchildren asked him once near the end of his life if he regretted losing the fingers. Daniel looked at his scarred hand, flexed the remaining digits. These fingers bought my humanity, he said. Small price to pay. Finn joined the Peace Corps in 1961, one of the first wave of volunteers, spent decades in developing countries, Africa, South America, Asia, always going to the hardest places, the places no one else wanted to serve. He married Margaret as planned, had 3 children. But he couldn't stay in Chicago, Couldn't live a comfortable life knowing what he knew. Couldn't forget the moment he wanted to quit and someone wouldn't let him. He told volunteers the same thing every orientation. Your first instinct isn't always your best instinct. Your better nature is something you choose. And sometimes you need someone to make you choose it. Be that person for someone else. Make them choose to be better. The years passed. 1950, 1960, the world changed. The war became history. The soldiers became middle-aged men with families and mortgages and normal lives. But Akiko never forgot her promise. In 1964, she made a decision. She would find James Carter. She would travel to America. She would say thank you in person. 20 years late, but better late than never. It took her 2 years to save the money, working extra shifts at the hospital, saving every yen. Anna helped, added her own savings. Mother, she said, you must do this. You must close this circle. It took 3 years to get the visa. Japan-United States relations were better but still complicated. Former prisoners of war weren't exactly welcome with open arms. But Akiko persisted, filled out forms, wrote letters, told her story to bureaucrats who didn't care until they heard about the blizzard, about the mercy, about the debt that must be paid. She overcame her fear of returning to the land of former enemies, fear of rejection, fear of discovering that the mercy had been forgotten, that it didn't matter anymore. Anna insisted on coming. I want to meet the man you named me for, she said. Anna Morrison had been impossible to find, but the soldier military records could help with that. Colonel Mitchell, long retired, helped track down the information. Letters forwarded from Ohio to Texas. Phone calls with patient operators who helped translate Akiko's broken English. Finally, an address, Fredericksburg, Texas, spring 1966. Akiko booked a flight, 6,000 miles, 22 years, one promise kept. April 12, 1966, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Texas Hill Country in full bloom. James's ranch was modest, 50 acres, a small house with a wraparound porch, a barn that had seen better days, cattle grazing in the distance, bluebonnets covering the fields in a carpet of purple and blue. The smell of mesquite smoke drifted from a barbecue pit behind the house. Marie was cooking, brisket that had been smoking since dawn, the scent thick and rich and utterly American. Inside, a radio played Willie Nelson, Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain. The teenagers were doing homework, complaining about algebra, normal, peaceful, home. Akiko stood at the door, 54 years old now. Some gray in her hair, but still strong. Black kimono, formal and crisp, hands trembling as she held a photograph. 4 American soldiers, young men who had saved her life. Anna stood beside her, 18 years old, camera ready to document the moment. Akiko raised her hand, knocked 3 times. Deliberate, ceremonial. Inside, Marie called out, "Honey, get the door." James opened it. For a moment, neither could speak. He was 45 now, gray in his hair, lines around his eyes, a slight limp from an old wound. But his eyes were the same. Blue, kind, the eyes that had looked at her with mercy instead of hate. Recognition was instant, electric. 22 years fell away. Akiko spoke. 5 words that carried the weight of a lifetime. "You carried me through hell, Mr. Carter." James whispered, "Akiko-san, you're alive. You made it." Behind him, Marie appeared, curious, protective. The teenagers peered from the hallway, sensing something important. The contrast was total. Texas heat versus a too cold. Bluebonnets versus snow. Life versus death. "Come in," James managed, voice breaking. "Please come in." They sat in the kitchen. Marie brought iced sweet tea, condensation beating on the glasses, ice clinking. The sound of Southern hospitality. Pecan pie appeared. Fresh bread. The table filling with food the way Texas tables do when guests arrive. The ceiling fan turned lazy circles. Cicadas sang outside. The afternoon sun slanted through windows. So completely, utterly American. So far from frozen hell. Akiko held her tea glass, felt the cold against her palms. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Something I never told anyone outside my family." James leaned forward. "In that bunker before you found us, we discussed suicide. We had 1 pistol, 15 bullets. We were ready. Noon was our deadline. She paused. Let the words sink in. You arrived at 11:47, 13 minutes before we would have used those bullets. James's hands trembled. The tea glass shook. 13 minutes. The difference between life and death. You saved us from more than the cold, Akiko continued. You saved us from ourselves, from the lie we had been told about honor. You showed me that real honor is not dying for a cause. It is choosing life even when life is hard. You taught me that mercy is not weakness. It is the greatest strength. She reached across the table, took his hand. I named my daughter after the nurse who gave me coffee, Nurse Anna Morrison, who sat with me when I cried. But I came here to tell you something more important. She gestured to Anna beside her. Your mercy did not just save 15 lives. It saved generations. Anna exists because you chose mercy. Her children will exist because you chose mercy. Your choice echoes through time. James's children came into the kitchen then, drawn by the emotion, by the sense that history was happening at their table. They sat. They listened. They asked questions. Tell us about the bunker, about the blizzard, about what it felt like to be saved. Anna translated when her mother's English failed. Marie brought more tea, more pie, put on a pot of coffee, the rich smell filling the kitchen. They talked for hours about war, about peace, about how a single act of mercy can change everything. As the sun set over the hill country, painting the sky orange and red, Akiko stood to leave. I will never forget, she said, and I will make sure my children remember. And their children. The story of the American soldier who chose mercy when hate would have been easier. James walked her to the car, Anna driving. Before she left, Akiko turned back. You asked me once in the hospital why we chose to accept rescue, why we did not use the pistol when we heard American voices. James nodded. He had wondered. Because of Hana, Akiko said, the youngest. She asked why he will had hurt Akiko-san, and I realized I could not shoot a 19-year-old girl who had not yet lived. So I chose to risk shame, to risk whatever the Americans would do, because life, even uncertain life, was better than certain death. Her eyes filled with tears. You taught me I was right to choose that. You showed me that mercy exists, even in war, especially in war. She bowed one last time. James bowed back. As the car pulled away down the dusty ranch road, James stood watching until it disappeared. Marie came out, put her arm around him. You never told me the whole story, she said softly. I know. It was hard to talk about. Still is. But now I'm glad she found me. Glad I know the mercy mattered. The years continued. 1970, 1980, 1990. In 1992, Akiko died. 80 years old, surrounded by family. Her daughter Anna holding her hand. Her last words were about the blizzard, about blue eyes in the darkness, about mercy in hell. In 1994, something unexpected happened. A historian named Helen Wong was recording her grandfather's memories for a family archive. Daniel Wong, 82 years old, mentioned casually, I once carried a Japanese nurse through a blizzard. Helen stopped the recording. Wait, what? You never told us this. Daniel was reluctant, uncomfortable with attention, but his granddaughter was persistent. He told her everything. Helen tracked down the others. Bear had died in 1987. Finn was alive in Florida. James was alive in Texas. She found Anna in Tokyo. Anna had her mother's diary. Every word, every detail, the 274 days. The vote, the rescue, the transformation. Helen wrote an article, Military History Journal first. Then major newspapers picked it up. Then a documentary filmmaker got interested. The story 50 years buried finally emerged. In 1997, a monument was erected on Attu Island. Few people ever see it. The island is too remote. You have to really want to get there. Military historians, dedicated veterans, families of those who served. But for those who make the journey, the monument is worth it. It shows two figures, one carrying another. No uniforms, no flags, no indication of nationality. Just two humans helping each other survive. The inscription reads simply, in the midst of war, mercy, in the face of death, life. February 18, 1944. 19 souls survived when mercy triumphed over hate. James attended the dedication ceremony. 77 years old, gray and weathered, walking with a cane. Bear was gone. Daniel came from California. Finn came from Florida. Three old men who had once been young soldiers making an impossible choice. The families came too. James's children and grandchildren. Daniel's grandchildren. Finn's children. From Japan, Anna and her children. Akiko's grandchildren. Two families once enemies now connected forever by mercy. James was asked to speak. He stood at the microphone, looking out at the crowd, looking at the monument, looking at the island where he had almost died trying to save 15 women he'd been trained to hate. "I'm not a hero," he said, his voice steady despite his age. "None of us were. We were just men who made a choice. The choice to help when helping cost everything. The choice to see the enemy as human. The choice to believe that mercy matters, even in war, especially in war." He paused, looked at Anna and her children. "Someone told me once that our better nature isn't something we have naturally. It's something we choose. And sometimes we need someone to remind us to make that choice. My grandfather reminded me. I reminded my men. And now I hope we can all remind each other. Mercy is always possible. Enemies can become friends. One choice can echo through generations." The crowd stood, applauded. But James wasn't thinking about applause. He was thinking about a frozen bunker, a dying coyote, a grandfather's lesson, 15 women who deserved a chance to live. He was thinking about the fact that because he chose mercy one day in 1944, Anna and her children existed. And maybe, just maybe, that was what his whole life had been building toward. That moment, that choice, that mercy. James died in December 2003, 83 years old, peacefully in his sleep, on his ranch, surrounded by Marie, his children, his grandchildren. A life well lived. 50 acres passed to his son, grandchildren learning to rope cattle, a legacy not of medals, but of mercy. The funeral was small, a church in Fredericksburg, family, neighbors, old soldiers. But Anna flew from Tokyo to Texas, 6,000 miles, just like her mother had 37 years earlier. She stood at the service, the crowd mostly strangers. But she had traveled across the world because a debt must be honored. She spoke. "This man saved my mother, and in saving her he saved me, and my children, and someday my grandchildren." Her voice was clear, strong, carrying the weight of memory. His mercy echoes through time, through generations. "I will make sure his grandchildren know what he did, that my grandchildren know what he did, because the world needs to remember." Mercy is possible. Enemies can become friends. One choice can change everything. She placed an origami crane on his casket, a perfect crane folded with the same care her mother had taught her, passed down from Akiko, who learned it in a hospital recovering from frostbite. Folding cranes from medical paper. One crane for one man who chose mercy, who carried 15 women through hell, who proved that even in the darkest places humanity survives. The measure of James Carter's life was not in medals or commendations or monuments. It was in the lives he saved, the generations that followed, the story that refused to die, the proof that mercy, even when it costs everything, is never wasted. Because mercy plants seeds that grow across time, seeds that become trees, trees that shelter generations yet unborn. Every time someone hears this story, every time someone chooses compassion over convenience, life over death, mercy over revenge, those seeds grow a little more. James Carter understood that standing on a frozen island in 1944, carrying a woman he had been trained to hate through a storm that should have killed them all, he understood that mercy was the hardest choice, and he chose it anyway, because that's what it means to be human. That's the cowboy code. That's the Texas way. That's the lesson passed down from Grandpa Samuel to James, from James to his children, from his children to their children, from Akiko to Anna, from Anna to her children, from the story to the world. The choice echoes forward, through 22 years, through 53 years, through 59 years, through generations yet unborn, and will continue to echo as long as someone tells the story, as long as someone chooses mercy, as long as someone remembers. One man's choice can change everything. On a Texas Hill Country cemetery, the headstone is simple. James Samuel Carter, 1920 to 2003. He chose mercy. Nothing about medals, nothing about rank, nothing about battles, just the choice that defined him, the choice that echoed through time, the choice that proved even in the frozen hell of war that mercy is always possible. And in that possibility lies hope. Hope that enemies can become friends, that hate can be overcome, that one act of kindness can ripple across decades and continents and generations. Hope that humanity, no matter how buried under propaganda and fear and war, can still rise to the surface. Hope that when faced with the hardest choice, when helping costs everything, when the smart move is to walk away, some will still choose to stay, will still choose to help, will still choose mercy, because that's what separates men from beasts. The beasts just react, just do what instinct tells them. But humans, real humans, they choose. They choose compassion over convenience. They choose mercy over revenge. They choose life over death. And that choice made on a frozen island on the edge of the world echoes still. In a diary kept in Tokyo, in a monument on Atu, in the stories told by children and grandchildren, in the memory of an old woman who traveled 6,000 miles to say thank you, in 5 words spoken on a Texas porch. You carried me through hell, and in the response whispered through tears, Akiko-san, you're alive. You made it. Yes, she made it. They all made it. Because 4 men chose mercy when mathematics said to walk away. Because one man remembered a lesson taught by his grandfather about a wounded coyote and what it means to be human. Because sometimes the right thing and the smart thing aren't the same thing. And when that happens, you have to decide what kind of person you are. James Carter decided. And his choice echoes still. Through time, through space, through generations. A testament to mercy, a monument to humanity, a story that refuses to die. Because some things matter more than survival. Some choices define who we are. And some mercies echo forever.